Chapter 2. The Corpse. How many flights of stairs have we gone down now? Link asked, looking up towards the ceiling, which had long since passed out of view. 10? 11, Zelda said. You're sure? Yes? Link could have sworn he'd only counted 10 flights of stairs, but he knew better than to question Zelda's memory. When they had crossed the bridge up above, they found themselves on the top floor of a massive Zonai tower, or perhaps a shaft that appeared to have been built directly into the rock. The walls and floors were made of the same gray stone that the bridge had been made of, and were inlaid in several places with some kind of script that Zelda claimed to be Zonai, though she was unable to read any of it. Each floor of the tower consisted of a wide, square walkway surrounding an open center, with a single staircase that alternated sides on each floor. Built within the walls of each landing were numerous alcoves and rooms, most of which were empty except for a handful that had contained strange Zonai artifacts, unlike anything he or Zelda had seen before. It took a long time to descend. Zelda, of course, wanted to look at everything, but there was also the fact that this structure, like the bridge outside of it, had deteriorated over time. Several of the staircases and even some entire floors had crumbled away. They had already had to leave the Don behind at the bridge, so that wasn't a concern, and thankfully their paraglider was enough to see them over those gaps. That was hardly ideal, however. It could hold the two of them aloft just as well as one, thanks to whatever magic had been woven into it, but it was nearly impossible to control. Link was determined to try to find a way to get Zelda her own someday. The thought of her slipping and falling down the massive shaft in the center of this structure terrified him. They hadn't often been in situations that required them both to hang on to the paraglider for dear life, but the fact that it happened at all concerned him. Of course, that wasn't his only concern. Nothing about this expedition sat right with him. Link wasn't a scientist, and he certainly couldn't be sure of how far they'd traveled, or even how long they'd been underground. But the fact that they were gone once again, descending, ate at him. How was it possible that they'd ventured so far underground? None of this felt like a normal cave system, even before they encountered these strange Zonai Ruins. It's almost like we've entered an entire other world down here, he thought, looking around. How long had it been since they'd seen the sun? How far underground were they? Were they even still in Hyrule? And would they be able to make it back up again? It reminded Link of the Lost Woods in all the worst ways. I think I see to the bottom. Link's gaze dropped back down to look at Zelda. She held the torch over the edge of the walkway, looking down into the shadows. When he joined her, he could see that she was indeed right. The unsteady light of the torch barely illuminated what looked like a chunk of fallen staircase below. It wasn't the ground, exactly, but it was close enough. They continued their descent until finally they reached the bottom. When Link looked up, he could see nothing but blackness. There was no hint of the upper floors or the ceiling. He knew that the ascent would be even harder to manage, and didn't look forward to what it would entail. They had brought plenty of rope with them, and it would be up to Link to scale the walls, where the walkways were broken, and help pull Zelda up after him. At least they'd brought plenty of food and water in their packs. Let's rest for a bit, Zelda said, slipping the heavy pack off her back and onto the ground. She rolled her shoulders and neck, groaning softly before setting down on a broken stone. Link followed suit, relieved to drop his burden and retrieve one of his water skins, guzzling down several gulps before wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. So how many in total? 17, Zelda said, after corking her own water skin again. 17 floors. Wait, no. 18. If you count the ground floor as the first. Do you think this was a natural shaft that they just built into? She didn't respond for a few seconds before she sighed, her shoulders slumping. She looked defeated, all of a sudden. I don't know. How did the Sheikah build an entire facility for constructing guardians beneath Hyrule Castle's sanctum? It's clear the Zonai, like the Sheikah, were advanced in many ways that we never knew. Link grunted, but chose not to follow up that point. The subject of the Sheikah and their technology was still a source of deep pain for his wife, even several years after she and the other Sheikah had made the decision to shut it all down and either bury or dismantle the ancient machines, lest they be co-opted by dangerous forces, such as the Yiga clan, or, highly forbid, Ganon again. Even with Purah's attempts to create new technology without the vulnerabilities of the old machines, Zelda's part in that decision still weighed heavily on her mind. He could still remember the way she'd wept when the towers retreated back into the ground, and the lights on the Sheikah shrines went out. She didn't speak with him for days following that event, drawing deep into herself. She spent hours at a time locked away in her study, within their small home, emerging only occasionally, and never for long. She refused to eat, barely drank, and often fell asleep at her desk. Link hadn't a clue how to help her. And then, after days of this, she emerged from her study, a determined expression on her exhausted face. Her hair was disheveled, clothing and skin dirty, and she'd clearly lost some weight. Yet within her hand was a notebook full of cramped writing. Lesson plans for the school she would build. They found themselves descending yet another tunnel. There were stairs at their feet, but the walls around them were mostly natural rock, except for the occasional angular Zonai pillars. Around them, the gloom seemed to have grown thicker, and the torchlight seemed weaker as a result. Zelda paused to watch as the dark mist swirled around in the wake of their passing. Like before, it did not seem to want to approach them. It disturbed Link, watching the way the gloom responded to their presence. He remembered all too well the way the malice had surrounded him, but remained just out of arm's reach when he claimed the Master Sword. Gloom may not have been the same as the Calamity's essence, but it was clearly close enough. Link was certain they had to be related. I think we must be getting close, Zelda said, turning to look back at Link. Why do you think that? Link looked down the dark tunnel, left hand balling into a tight fist. I can't explain it, I feel as though we're being watched. Link felt the hair on the back of his neck rise at her words. He'd been feeling that very sensation, though for far longer than just upon entering this tunnel. He'd felt that way all day. The dread one felt when being stalked. The feeling that prey felt right before being pounced upon. Just stay close to me. Link reached back and drew the Master Sword. As always, the blade felt natural in his hand, an extension of Link's arm, of his very being. It was a comfort to hold the sword, even if he'd hoped to never need to draw it from its pedestal in the heart of the great Deku Tree's glade again. They continued down the stairs with Zelda walking to Link's right now, leaving his left side clear in case he needed to attack. It was a practice motion, one born of their travels together, both before the calamity and after. Zelda held the torch in her right hand, away from Link's direct line of sight. It still provided ample light to see their next steps, but this way he wasn't blinded, just in case something came at them from the front. Zelda even fell into step with him, their footfalls sounding at almost the exact same time. It made Link think of the way he and the other squires had drilled with each other and their respective knights, day in and day out. And despite countless exercises, those drills have never felt nearly so natural as the way he and Zelda moved together. Together they had faced evil and horror, monsters, beasts, and a godlike entity determined to destroy their entire world. Before the calamity, Link had been Zelda's protector, and he still was now. But that dynamic had evolved over the years. Zelda was no fighter, yet she had saved Link's life many times over, whether by good use of the old Sheikah Slate's offensive and defensive abilities, or simply by being a second set of eyes to catch that which he missed. Link found himself reaching out with his right hand, taking Zelda's and giving it a firm squeeze before releasing it again. If they did come face to face with the calamity again, they would prevail. Together. Look! More Zonai construction, Zelda said abruptly. Link had seen the outline of the brick archway a split second before, and as they approached, the arch gave way to a long corridor-like room, made of cut brick, as the earlier structure had been. Lining the walls were angular obelisks placed in alcoves between support pillars, and Link could see more of the ancient Zonai text carved into their faces. Incredible. Zelda traced her fingers over the text on one such obelisk. Link thought that he could see hints of what may have once been gold trim within the unfamiliar letters. I hope Toro will be able to translate some of this when we get back to the surface. As she took pictures with the Pura pad, Link wandered a few paces from her, examining another monolithic statue, though this one had fallen on its side. It was flatter than the obelisk, and while its front still had lines of the Zonai text, it also bore a symbol in its center. It took Link a moment to realize what the various curved lines with the large emerald at its center depicted, and when he realized it, he only found himself more confused. Zelda, come here. She knelt beside him a moment later, holding the torch out to better see the symbols carved into the fallen statue. It's an eye. She reached out, running her fingers along the stone. It isn't the Sheikah eye, or at least not as we know it now, but the similarities. She trailed off and began taking pictures of this artifact as well. Link didn't know what to make of any of this. Ancient Zonai, never-ending caverns, the resurgence of malice. He didn't care what Zelda's researchers called it. Her preoccupation with the strange eye design did not last long, and she was soon drawn to an entirely different kind of statue. The statue depicted a tall figure, bipedal, with arms that rested at its sides. That was where the similarities to a Hylian ended, however. Its neck was far too long, and ended in a head that appeared animal-like, with big eyes and a snout, along with enormous triangular ears that stretched out to either side, each larger than its head. Could this be a Zonai? Zelda whispered, reaching up and touching the statue. A pair of them stood on either side of another archway that led deeper into this building. No one has ever found a depiction of them like this. Most scholars tended to think that the Zonai were just an offshoot of Hylians, but this... Look at its ears. It made me think of a fox. I think its face kind of looks like a goat, though, Link said, frowning up at the statue. Zelda glanced at him and then back up at the statue, tilting her head. I don't know. Zonai Ruins on the surface often have depictions of dragons, owls, or boars. I've never seen anything like a goat. What about a fox? Well, no, but I was merely stating that its ears reminded me of one. Zelda began taking pictures again, capturing the statue from each angle. I actually think its face looks almost feline. So you think the Zonai were cat people? Zelda snorted. I didn't say that. But that would be better than goat people. Goats are more useful than cats. I failed to see how that bears any relevance to what a Zonai looks like, she said. He saw her lips beginning to form a smile, however. And besides, I disagree. I think cats are quite useful. They are natural rodent hunters, after all. I remember the castle kept quite a few cats around to keep the rat population down. Link leaned against the arch. Uh-huh. I seem to remember you sneaking dinner scraps to some of the cats. You know, that's a terrible way to encourage them to hunt rats. Oh, is it? Zelda asked, clearly feigning ignorance. It's amazing the things my tutors failed to adequately teach me. She glanced towards Link, her teeth showing in a bright smile. Link felt his own smile grow in response. It probably didn't help that you knew more than your tutors by the time you were 10. Don't be absurd. I didn't surpass them in knowledge until I was 13 at the earliest. Link barked a laugh that echoed off the stone walls and straightened as Zelda clipped the Pura pad back to her waist. Come on, she said after situating the device. Let's see what the next room has to offer. He nodded and stepped through the dark archway, into a much more spacious room, though the presence of the gloom in the air made it difficult to judge its size. He flinched as a few keys took flight, and flew past him, squeaking, and he heard Zelda give off a soft yelp behind him as they darted out of the archway into the room they'd come from. "I'm surprised we haven't seen more of those," he remarked, stepping further into the room, eyes alert for any potential threat. Zelda stepped up beside him, running her fingers through her hair. "You know, that's a good point. We've encountered very little life down here, haven't we? Even insects and other creatures you'd expect to thrive down here. I haven't seen many of them in quite some time. Have you?" Link shook his head, eyes fixed on a point in the distance. He thought it was the opposite wall, but it looked oddly textured. Not at all like the simple gray stone that had made up most of the other walls, nor the natural rock of the tunnels. As he and Zelda took another step forward, however, and the torch finally cast its illumination on it, he understood. It was the wall, but rather than brick, it was covered with an enormous carved mural. Zelda gasped and rushed forward until she stood right before it, looking up with wide eyes. "Link, look," Zelda said, her voice barely above a whisper. "What is this? Link stepped up beside her, looking up at the relief carved into the wall, surprised at just how much he could make out. While other sections of this structure had crumbled to ruin, this mural was still mostly intact. The paint that had been used to give the additional detail had mostly faded over the years, but the carving was still sharp and clear. And unless Link was sorely mistaken, this particular mural depicted some kind of war between Hyrule and a force of monsters. He could see surprisingly accurate depictions of bokoblins and moblins, as well as winged creatures of a sort he wasn't familiar with. Fighting the force of monsters was a paltry force of what he thought to be Hylians, though they were dressed somewhat like the statues of Zonai had been. They raised swords and shields to the tide of monsters, but Link also saw quite a few of the figures lying prone on the ground. The monsters took up the majority of the mural, with the remnants of red paint seeming to coat the ground all around them, and the fallen Hylians' blood perhaps. It looked as though tendrils of it were reaching out to the Hylians still opposing the monsters. Hovering over the battlefield was what looked like a black sun, and behind the horde of monsters was a massive humanoid figure with a pair of spiked horns and a wide open-mouthed grin beneath a thick beard. It looked to Link as though the man was commanding the army of monsters. Looking at that man, Link felt a sudden and visceral urge to fight. He gripped the Master Sword tightly and he felt goose flesh erupt all down his arms. The man's eyes seemed to sparkle with hatred and evil delight as the horde of monsters overran the embattled Hylians. "Zelda, what is this?" Zelda reached up, touching the mural with a trembling finger. He heard her whispering to herself. "The calamity? But no. No, that doesn't..." Suddenly she turned, and only then did Link realize that there was more than one mural. Beside the mural depicting the battle was a smaller one, though this one was also dominated by the same hateful-looking man. Though this one lacked horns. In this one, he held up his hand, and some kind of teardrop-shaped object floated just above it, while more of the red blood-like substance formed a wave that crested overhead. There was also a woman in this image, bent over backwards with long hair spilling down towards the ground. Zelda paused at this mural as well, but only momentarily before moving on to the next mural in line, and then to the final mural. Link followed, growing more unsettled by the moment. He looked behind himself, half expecting to see some dark creature oozing out of the shadows, but found nothing. "Link, I think that this might be showing the birth of the Kingdom of Hyrule." He turned his attention back to Zelda, looking up at the mural. This one depicted a Zonai, or at least what Link thought was a Zonai, based on the statues outside of this room. It stood, or sat, on some kind of floating platform, hands outstretched to either side, with 7 of those teardrop-shaped objects floating in a semicircle around its head. the birth of... I don't... Link started confused, but Zelda pressed on, excited. Look! This mural depicts a Zonai. Legends say that the Zonai came from the heavens, and I think that's what this is showing, see? These swirls above, those must be clouds. Zelda's head twisted this way and that, as if she were racing to see as much as she could within a short time. She motioned at a group of people at the bottom of the mural. And these figures look like Hylians. And here are mountains. Could this be Death Mountain? And look here. Zelda moved on to the next mural in the line. This one depicting the Zonai, who he thought to be the woman that was bent backwards in the other one. The legends of the royal family state that our bloodline was born from the union with gods, who had descended from above. And this mural, I think it might be depicting that. But instead of gods as we think of them now, it shows a Zonai and a Hylian. Link could see what she meant. This mural depicted the Zonai and Hylian woman looking at each other with their hands crossed between them, while a pair of teardrops shone above their heads. Below them were several other Hylian figures, hands raised and crossed with those beside them. So you think that the Zonai were gods? Link asked, reaching out and taking the torch from her so she could begin taking pictures once again. I don't know. That's just what our legend says now, that the royal line has divine blood. Perhaps I'm misinterpreting these murals, but this certainly looks like a union between the Zonai that came from the heavens and the Hylians down below, does it not? Link frowned. But don't you literally have Hylia's divine sealing powers? That gave Zelda a moment's pause before she shook her head. That may be so, but that hardly means anything. What if Hylia was a Zonai? For all we know, the Hylians have simply gotten it wrong or wanted to fashion her to be more in our likeness after the Zonai disappeared. She began taking pictures rapidly, musing out loud as she did so. Or maybe Hylia herself was simply a Hylian woman who wed a Zonai, and the details were modeled over the years? That would turn so much of the royal history on its head, but I cannot deny that... What about these ones? Link asked, moving toward the two murals with the ominous-looking man. Zelda stepped up beside him, looking up at the depiction of the woman bent over backwards. She considered it for several seconds, before speaking. This figure, I can't say for certain, but there is a legend that stretches back to the earliest days of the kingdom. She continued taking pictures of this image while speaking. The legend spoke of a great war called the Imprisoning War between the allied tribes of Hyrule and someone only referred to as the Demon King. Once again, Link felt a shudder run through him, and he couldn't stop himself from glancing around to ensure they were still alone. At first I thought this mural was depicting the first calamity, but no. No, it doesn't line up. There are no other guardians, no divine beasts. And in Impa's tapestry, the calamity is shown to be more bestial. No, this war scene depicts a man, save for his horns. A demon, Link said, turning his attention back to Zelda. Exactly. A demon king. And look at this one. She drew his attention back to the mural with the figure she had called the Demon King, and the woman. He doesn't have horns here, but it looks as though he perhaps took that teardrop object from the woman. Could it be that this shows the birth of the Demon King? Here he is born, and then this mural must depict the Great War recorded in the royal histories. Zelda's excitement was palpable now, her words spelling out rapidly. I think this is incredible. These murals both simultaneously confirm our history as well as completely turn them on their heads. She spun to face him, eyes wide. This is a huge discovery. Why, I could fill an entire library with books about the implications of everything we found down here. Link opened his mouth, but Zelda had already turned her back to him again, staring at the mural. And then if this depicts the imprisoning war, then... She walked past the large war scene, but stopped short. There appeared to be 7 total murals that covered this wall, but the final 3 had been hidden behind a massive pile of stone. Some of the ceiling had collapsed here. Zelda stood staring up at the rubble, her smile fading, replaced by a deep frown. Link could see the wheels turning in her head, as she tried to work out a way to somehow clear the rubble to see the murals behind. She reached out, pushing on one of the massive stones, but it didn't shift in the slightest. I'll have to bring a team down here. I'm sure I could bring a Goron or two. They would make quick work of this. And my Zonai researchers, they must see this. Taro will be positively ecstatic. Again, Link felt that spike of dread and anxiety. That certainty that they weren't alone. And he spun, ready to face whatever was creeping up on them. And once more, he found nothing there, save for the empty room. Link! He looked sharply back at Zelda, eyes scanning. But when he saw her, she looked right at him with wide, even fearful eyes. Except when he followed her gaze, he realized she wasn't looking at him. She was looking at the Master Sword in his left hand, which had begun to shine with a pale blue-white light. Link stared at the blade, his mind blank with shock. In the past, it had only responded like this when near Calamity Ganon, or the entities it's possessed, such as the Guardians or the resurrected monsters during the Blood Moon. Link hadn't seen it do so since defeating and sealing away Calamity Ganon. Suddenly he understood the very ominous feelings he had been having ever since coming into this room. It was a sensation he hadn't felt in over 6 years. The spirit of the Master Sword reaching out to his mind, conveying its own thoughts and emotions through the mystical bond he shared with the sword. And those feelings that it conveyed to him were exactly the sort of feelings it had shared with him when fighting Calamity Ganon. His hand tightened on the hilt of the Master Sword, knuckles growing white. He met Zelda's eyes, which showed a new degree of fear. There wasn't terror in her eyes, not like he'd seen in the early days of the Calamity, nor did he feel the blind terror himself any longer. The two of them had defeated the Calamity at the height of its power, which gave him a measure of confidence, but neither of them could deny the fear they felt. If it's back, then... Zelda took a deep breath, steeling herself. Link could see in the way her expression changed her efforts to wrestle her emotions back under control. If the Calamity has truly returned, then it must still be weakened from our battle. Will the Master Sword be enough? Link asked. He hated speaking that concern out loud, but it needed to be said. It had been years since Zelda felt even a hint of her former power. It was certainly possible that her power would return now, as it seemed to be tied to the need. But he didn't know if either of them could rely on that. Zelda winced, noticeably, at his question, and she took several moments to respond. When she did, her eyes were downcast. It may have to be. I wish I could confidently say I will be able to call upon my divine sealing power again, but it seems now that even that was hardly enough to truly seal the Calamity away. Zelda, don't. Link stepped closer to her, shaking his head. Don't blame yourself. If it is back, and we don't know that for sure yet, then it isn't your fault. Ganon is craftier than either of us thought possible. It's possible that it had a backup plan that no one knew about all along. Zelda nodded stiffly and met Link's eyes. You're right. It won't do either of us good to worry about what we could have done differently. Link handed her back the torch while giving her a tight smile. Okay, are you ready? No. Zelda took another deep, steadying breath. But I must be. Let's keep going. Together they turned away from the murals and made their way to the only other way out of the room, descending yet another series of stairs in a much more claustrophobic tunnel, with natural stone walls closer than Link's outstretched arms. The gloom is growing thicker, Zelda said just behind him. Link had noticed. This particular tunnel seemed to be choked with stuff, a thick fog that made it difficult to see more than a few feet out. The added light emanating from the Master Sword helped to cut through the darkness somewhat, and as always the gloom pulled back as they ventured deeper. But as soon as they passed, the fog drew close behind them, the torch's light now only showing the shifting cloud. Zelda, if we get down there and... I'm not leaving you, Link. He glanced back over his shoulder, mouth still open in an unfinished word. He met her eyes and cleared his throat. I was merely going to suggest you hang back. If I have to fight something, I don't want to have to worry about your safety too. Oh, she said. I will. Link hoped his words didn't come off as callous, but at the same time, there had been many situations over the years that he'd had to split his attention between keeping himself alive and ensuring she was safe too. The most significant of which resulted in his being mortally wounded, and Zelda subsequently awakening her powers. He hoped it wouldn't come to that again. But he also knew that he couldn't send Zelda away. As much as he loathed putting her in harm's way, she very well could be the key to stopping the calamity again, if that was indeed what they were about to encounter. And the two of them were partners. Where she went, he went, and vice versa. They continued. As they did so, the only sounds that Link could hear were their rhythmic footsteps on the ancient stairs. He could see nothing except for the stairs and the rough rock walls on either side. His heart pounded, and he adjusted his grip on the Master Sword. His hand was sweating. We're almost there, he thought. He didn't know how he knew that, but it was plain as day to him. Any moment now, they would reach their destination. The source of the gloom and whatever it was had awoken the Master Sword. Zelda drew closer to him and took his right hand in her own. He would have rather kept that hand free, but he could hardly begrudge her. The walls around them only seemed to grow closer and more claustrophobic the further down they traveled, and he was comforted by the feel of her hand in his, too. He finally saw the end of the tunnel below, an archway that appeared to be a black maw that grew as they approached. He gave Zelda's hand one final squeeze before releasing it, instead taking the Master Sword in both hands, holding it low, so as not to bind himself with its light. This was it. He took one final step down, his eyes finally descending to the threshold of the archway, giving Link his first view of what lay beyond. And what he saw made no sense. It was an enormous cavern, large enough that Link couldn't see the walls on the other side. He also couldn't see the floor, as their tunnel emerged out onto a narrow outcrop of rock that overlooked a pit of undeterminable depth. The ceiling was high, and dominated in its center by an inverted pyramidal-shaped structure that jutted out from the rock in the center of the cavern. And finally, suspended over the center of the pit, was a rock island, held aloft by 3 stone bridges, one of which was at the bottom of another flight of stairs from Link's and Zelda's outcrop. Of course, in that moment, Link didn't see any of this. Instead, at first, all he saw was the strange blue-green swirl of misty energy that flowed up in a slow, expanding spiral to the ceiling, and that inverted pyramid. Within the spiral were odd shapes that looked like runes, that faded in and out of existence. At the heart of the spiral was a disembodied hand that glowed with the same brilliant blue-green light. The hand was positioned palm down, fingers curled in a claw, with its forearm upright. It was from this arm that the powerful energy swirl originated from. At first, Link thought that the hand merely floated in the air like a ghostly specter. But then he saw the corpse. The desiccated body under the hand was hard to make out, largely due in part to the massive amount of gloom that seemed to be pouring out of the body in all directions. The gloom flowed out from the body's chest, like a rolling fog, pulling on the ground of the suspended island, before expanding, floating up into the air, and over the sides into the darkness below. The dark miasma seemed to originate from right beneath the glowing hand, as if the hand were attempting to staunch the flow. Or perhaps was releasing it. "Oh, Hylia, what is that?" Zelda said, stepping up beside Link. She stared down at the ethereal scene with wide, confused eyes. Neither of them had known what to expect when venturing down beneath the castle. But this... Link had no idea what to make of this. He began down the stairs, which zigzagged down until reaching the level of the suspended platform. Even closer, it was still hard for Link to make out any details about the figure in the center, thanks to the sheer amount of red-black fog pouring out of it. He could see that it wasn't lying on the ground, but was instead bent over backwards, its feet still on the ground while its torso was parallel to the ground. Was the hand somehow holding it up to keep it from collapsing? As he and Zelda began to cautiously cross the stone bridge, some of the details began to come into view. The body was indeed something of a mummified corpse of a man. What skin it had was dry and dark gray, pulled tight over its skeleton. Its face bore no lips or nose, and it looked more as though Link could see its desiccated muscles rather than a layer of skin. It still had ears, but its eyes were empty sockets. A long mane of hair grew from the back of its head and reached all the way to the ground. Though it was hard to make out in the darkness, Link thought its hair had a reddish color. Its arms were outstretched to either side, each bony finger ending in claw-like nails. Its feet were bare, and its toenails too were long and claw-like. It wore the tattered remnants of a clothing style that Link wasn't familiar with, which consisted mostly of a skirt-like wrap around its waist that reached down past its knees, as well as a strip of cloth that hung over one arm. It was covered in golden jewelry, multiple bracers and rings on its arms and hands, a large ornamental necklace that rested on its chest and shoulders with multiple jeweled pendants, and finally a starburst-shaped headdress that rested on its forehead. The center of the headdress held a teardrop-shaped gem that seemed to shine with a very pale light. "I don't," Link started, but then stopped when the glowing hands shifted. Its forearm drooped, and then the entire thing fell over sideways, off the corpse and to the ground. The bright light emanating from it faded, and the spiral of energy dissipated, casting the cavern into further darkness save for the Master Sword and Zelda's torch. Something broke free of the back of the hand, something that clicked across the ground and caught the light of the Master Sword as it bounced past Link's feet. It looked to be a gemstone of sorts, but Link paid it little heed. His eyes were instead on the corpse, which somehow remained in the same position, feet planted, back bent over backwards, head forward, mouth open in a silent scream, frozen in time. Behind him, Link heard Zelda say, "What's this?" Overhead, the last of the green spiral disappeared just as the light from the fallen arm faded completely. The corpse's outstretched hand flinched. The body moved. It didn't fall as one might have expected, but instead, its hands and arms began flexing, their joints cracking audibly. Its chest began to move, and Link watched in stunned silence as it began to straighten from its bent position. Its movements were jerky and strained. Before it could fully straighten to a standing position, it suddenly fell backwards again, its back bending so much that its head hung limply upside down, hair spilling to the ground around it, some of its jewels dangling. Yet its feet were still planted on the ground. Everything after happened too fast. The corpse's head turned to look at Link and Zelda, its empty sockets shining with the light of a pair of orange, slitted eyes. Its mouth moved. The Master Sword pulsed in a sudden, desperate warning, and Link thought he heard the sword's voice in his head. Gloom erupted from the corpse's chest like a sudden, red-black flame, tendrils reaching high into the air above Link and Zelda, before descending towards them in a rush. Link acted. Even as the tendrils of gloom reached for Zelda, he pushed between her and it, swinging the shining Master Sword to intercept it. It felt like he struck something solid, and the sword rang out, as if it had struck a stone wall. The gloom pulled back just for a moment, as if hesitating, and then it rushed forward once again. The Master Sword pulsed with its brilliant light, the light which dispelled the darkness. The light that Calamity's malice could not bear to even touch. The divine light of the goddess Hylia. And the gloom consumed it. It flowed down the sword, blacking out its light completely, and then reached his hand. Link screamed. His arm burned, as if he'd thrust it into an open flame. It was all he could do to keep hold of the Master Sword as the red-black tendrils of power coursed up his arm, completely burning away the sleeve of his tunic, all the way up to his shoulder. He tried to pull his arm back from the incredible pain, but the tendrils of gloom wrapped around him like hundreds of gripping, slicing claws. And then, just as suddenly, it was gone. Link nearly collapsed, grabbing his now useless left arm in his right hand. The Master Sword held limply at his side. He spared a glance down, barely comprehending the lifeless, colorless, charred-looking flesh that made up his left arm. It still felt as though it were ablaze with fire, and smoky wisps of gloom rose from it. The wisp floated up from the Master Sword as well. The sword's blade was tarnished, its light dimmed. Link could see dark patches of gloom coating parts of the blade. He could hear a voice screaming in his head. The spirit of the Master Sword was in agony. Link! He looked up to see yet another eruption of power bursting from the dead man's chest, rushing towards him. Link's body moved of its own accord, recalling its years of training even as his mind struggled to comprehend what had just happened. His burned arm swung the Master Sword with one final burst of strength, and the tarnished blade arced to meet the tendril of gloom. The sword and the dark power met once more. Link heard the wail of determination and pain, the sword's intent aligning with his. He felt it happen. The lurch as the sword's weight and balance abruptly changed. There was a brief burst of light. The wordless voice in his head was silenced. The Master Sword shattered. He watched dumbstruck as the ancient holy blade broke under the weight of this creature's power. One shining shard flew forward, carried by the momentum of Link's swing. The shard passed by the corpse's face, cutting a shallow red line in its cheek. Gloom, not blood, bubbled from the cut as the shard of the Master Sword arced and passed into the darkness. Link couldn't speak. He stared, eyes wide in horror, at the broken sword in his hand. Gloom still clung to it, seeming to eat away at the half-blade that remained. The Master Sword's light went out completely. He heard Zelda cry out his name. Fear and concern laced through her voice, but it sounded so very far away. He felt her hands on his shoulders, bracing him. Was she the only thing still keeping him upright? The Master Sword had shattered. The corpse spoke. Its voice was a rasp, distorted by its lipless mouth. And yet its words were clear and understandable.
Was that the sword that seals the darkness?
Slowly it began to stand upright, each of its joints crackling.
I expected more. A blade that shatters so easily cannot hope to save you from my power.
Link grimaced, his legs shaking from the effort to stay standing. The pain in his arm was unbearable. The pain was spreading, traveling now into his shoulder and across his chest. He had to grit his teeth to keep himself from groaning. The man finally stood upright. Its eyes flicked past Link, and there it briefly paused before speaking again.
Zelda.
Ice ran down Link's back at the use of Zelda's name. How did this thing know her? But it wasn't finished. Its eyes turned again to Link.
And you, who carries that fragile sword? You are Link, are you not?
How? Zelda whispered. The corpse gave a short, gravely chuckle.
Rauru placed his faith in you, and that was the best you could do.
The skin around its eyes crinkled in what Link thought was indicative of a smile, though the skin around its blackened teeth didn't move. Zelda found her voice. How do you know our names? Who are you? The creature brought its hands together over its chest, and Link saw it beginning to gather its power once more, gloom compressing into a writhing mass between its fingers. He wanted to tell Zelda to run, to get away as fast as she could. He would do his best to buy her time. But he couldn't. Link simply couldn't. His body wouldn't move, his mouth wouldn't speak. The broken Master Sword hung limply in his hand, somewhere deep in his mind. He recognized the symptoms of battlefield shock. The man suddenly thrust his hands up towards the ceiling and the inverted pyramid. Gloom burst free like before, but this time it slammed against the roof of the cavern, expanding out and covering everything above. The entire cavern began to shake violently, and a low, deafening rumble filled the air. Chunks of stone broke free of the roof, one of them slamming into the island platform that the corpse had been on. The platform began to collapse, yet the creature's power continued to flow up and into the roof of the cavern. "Link!" Zelda's voice finally broke him from his shock. He spun to face her, horrified to see the ground beneath her feet beginning to give way, too. She reached for him with one hand, eyes wide in terror. Then she fell. Years of training did not compel Link's body to move this time. No training would have made him do what he did, after all. No, this time it was something entirely different that caused him to throw aside the broken Master Sword and dive headfirst after his falling wife. He couldn't lose her. "Zelda!" She was right there, falling, one hand still outstretched towards him as she descended into the darkness, her other clenched into a fist against her chest. He lunged with his damaged hand, blackened and bleeding fingers desperately reaching for his Zelda. He spared no thought for what would happen even if he caught her. Their fingertips brushed. Something suddenly grabbed Link by the right arm, wrenching him to a painful halt, and he watched in horror as Zelda continued to fall, their eyes meeting for the briefest seconds. She didn't make another sound. He thought, for the briefest of moments, that he saw a golden halo of light surround her, just like he'd seen on the killing fields of Blatchery Plains over 100 years ago. But then she was consumed by darkness and passed out of sight. "No!" Tears blurred his eyes and he screamed. But his voice was drowned out as more stones from the ceiling fell around him. He had to get down there. He had to find her, to get her out of here, before the entire cavern collapsed on them. She would be okay. She had to be okay. The thing that had grabbed Link's arm tightened, and he finally looked up to see that the disembodied hand from earlier had come back to life somehow. It had been the thing that caught him, the thing that prevented him from grabbing Zelda's hand. "Let go," Link mumbled, tears blurring his vision. He tried to reach up with his damaged hand, but he could no longer even move it. "I need to find her. Let me go. Zelda, I need to..." The hand began to lift Link higher, even as his babbles grew incoherent. His vision grew even blurrier as more tears formed. The blackness at the edges of his vision was a sign that he was losing consciousness. "Zelda, please." Overhead, the ceiling grumbled away, completely, and Link thought that he could see a faint light overhead, far, far overhead. Daylight. How could he be seeing daylight? Everything went dark as he finally succumbed to the pain and despair.